May 21st, 1996. On a stormy night in Toronto, Ontario, two security guards discover the blood-soaked body of a transvestite prostitute, shot execution style and left for dead.
When he went down to that stairwell, he didn't know what was going to happen until he turned to face the gun and realized that he was going to die.
Before long, investigators are tracking a possible serial killer.
On an average year in Toronto, there's about 60 homicides, but to have 3 in the span of 24 hours would be very unusual.
The street workers and the residents lived in fear. The panic was pretty strong.
Along with police, there are those who chronicle the investigation up close, on film, on paper, and on tape. They are the public's first witness. Through their lens, they capture our darkest chapters of crime. Toronto, Ontario, Canada's largest metropolis, and no stranger to what is often referred to as the world's oldest profession. Like in all urban centers, Toronto's sex industry takes many forms. From escort agencies with storefronts and regular business hours, to the men, women, and transsexuals who ply their trade after dark, on lonely street corners and in dark alleys. It can be dangerous work, and those involved are easy targets for predators.
Prostitution business goes 365 nights a year. I think on any level prostitutes are vulnerable, but especially the ones that, have to work on the street, either for drugs or to make money for, their day-to-day survival.
Mainly because of the type of business they're in. They put themselves in compromising positions right away where they're going to isolated places with people that they don't know. It's a matter of luck, one way or another, whether or not you're going there with somebody that wants to part with their money for their moment of satisfaction, or whether or not it's a person that has some evil intentions towards you and may cause you some harm.
May 1996. As summer approaches, one familiar face on Toronto's downtown streets is 19-year-old Sean Keegan, originally from a smaller community to the east.
Sean Keegan was a drag queen, a very outgoing, friendly sort of young man. He ran away from home when he was young, not secretly. He simply told his family he didn't fit in and wanted to go to the big city.
He had hopped around from shelter to shelter, so he was well known to a number of us. So he was very well liked in the community, had a lot of friends on the street.
He told his mother and his father that he felt that he had finally found a place where he could belong. He loved the freedom of it, but the freedom came with a cost for him because he didn't have that much skill for jobs. He began turning tricks as a sex worker on the streets of Toronto.
Monday, May 21st, the end of the Victoria Day long weekend. Although stormy weather is forecast, meaning few will be out on the streets, Sean braces himself for a night of work.
A friend of his had given him a scarf to wear, a bright-colored scarf to wear around his neck that night so that he could look pretty. And this was how she put it.
Sean is nervous about working alone, and by 11 p.m., he is braving one of the worst storms of the year.
That night was an unusual night in the fact that it was torrential downpours in the Toronto area and an absolutely spectacular lightning storm, interspersed with people letting off fireworks since it was Victoria Day.
Not far off, 31-year-old transsexual Thomas Wilkinson, known to many simply as Deanna, also stands alone.
They weren't working with a partner. There was no night to be out there. So I imagine they were out there because they were pretty desperate for money.
At the same time, on the other side of downtown, a young woman named Brenda Ludgate has the street to herself in an area frequented by female prostitutes.
Brenda Ludgate was a 25-year-old female from a good family. Seems to have started running around with the wrong people, more or less. Became addicted to certain drugs and ended up in prostitution to support her habit.
She had a loving family, a mother in particular who was very, very nice lady. And no matter what Brenda's life had taken her, in which direction Brenda's life had taken her, her mother remained close to her, remained a loving mother.
11:10 p.m. While rain, thunder, and fireworks fill the night sky, a potential customer approaches Brenda.
She would have just been standing on a corner, standing on the sidewalk. She has to get into his car. As soon as that happens, he has the power.
And when she got into his car, she had no idea what was going to happen.
11:15. Not far off, area residents are winding down the long weekend in a high-rise building.
There was 3 of them in an apartment. They were visiting with friends, and they had heard fireworks and different things like that. But in amongst all the noise, they were sure that they had heard some yelling and some arguing.
One of them decides to investigate.
The witness was out on her balcony, and she looked down there and she saw a vehicle that was red in color, that was a truck. And then once the vehicle had left, she saw what appeared to be a body lying there.
Rushing to the parking lot below, the group finds the body of Brenda Ludgate, lying dead in a pool of blood. Crime reporter and photographer Jim Rankin learns of the discovery on his police scanner.
And it was very moody that night with the rain and the darkness. The media was kept back probably 30, 40 meters from where the body was. There was a lone cruiser parked there with the headlights on, illuminating a brick wall, and she was laying face up, looking at the sky. That's how they found her. The one photo I took that night that stands out and brings me back to the moment was a police officer standing near the body, holding a handheld light, and the cruiser is parked in front of the body, so you don't see it, but it's implied.
Homicide detective James Raymer is soon on the scene, searching for both clues and a cause of death.
At that time, we didn't know for sure what had happened. It had been violent, and she had quite obviously some severe trauma to her head area. There was a lot of blood.
While Brenda's body is removed for autopsy, the weather makes finding tire tracks, fingerprints, and other trace evidence at the crime scene next to impossible.
It was just pouring. I mean, it would have defeated anything or destroyed any potential evidence of that type had there been any.
In such conditions, investigators may have little more to go on than the memory of the eyewitnesses.
They were agitated, but they were calm and composed, and they were eager to assist us and provide us whatever information they could.
But when it comes to a description of the red truck, getting specific information involving either make or model proves difficult.
The witness herself was not somebody that readily knew different vehicles. She didn't readily recognize the type of truck that it was.
Even more ominous, news of another crime is now making its rounds on police radios. Shortly after Brenda's body was discovered, tenants of a building on the other side of downtown noted a disturbance in the exposed stairwell that leads to their underground parking lot.
They thought they may have heard gunshots that were a little different from the fireworks and the firecrackers that people were setting off at the time.
They had heard a loud bang. They seen a male figure in dark clothing come out of the stairwell. There was 2 security guards there at the time. So both of those security guards had then gone to the stairwell to investigate what was going on.
Inside the stairwell, they stumble across the body of 19-year-old transvestite Sean Keegan. By all appearances, he has been shot in the head.
It's not unusual to be on that shift and have one homicide. What was unusual is that there's 2, and within a short span of time. So that immediately sort of got you thinking, is there a connection between the 2?
The discovery of a 3rd body will turn the night into one of the bloodiest in recent memory. If all are linked, Toronto may have a serial killer on the loose. May 21st, 1996. In downtown Toronto, 2 prostitutes have been brutally murdered in the space of an hour. While police battle the elements in the parking lot where Brenda Ludgate was discovered, the body of 19-year-old transvestite Sean Keegan is removed from an exposed stairwell on the other side of downtown. Forensic expert Dave Whelan and his partner arrive on the latest scene.
I don't know at this point whether it's a serial killing or whether is one related to the other. I'm not sure. There's only one way in from ground level. And so what we can see is a concrete stairwell that disappears down into the earth. It was very dark. The rain was just teeming down, like it was coming down in buckets. And that was one of the biggest challenges for that scene, was to try and contain that and make it manageable.
A tarp is secured over the stairwell before the team moves in to search for potential clues.
When I had got down to that 2nd level of the stairwell and turned the corner, the first thing I saw was a lot of blood. You know, with any scene, you walk in, and of course my practice is to capture it on film first. I'm trying to be the scene storyteller. I'm trying to let the jury know and the judge know exactly what it looked like when I got there, what I collected, what I did.
Like at the Brenda Ludgate scene, rain has destroyed almost all hope of finding the killer's fingerprints.
The crime scene really didn't tell us a great deal about what had happened at that time. It could have been a sexual predator of some sort. It could have been a drug ripoff.
The painstaking search finally yields an important clue.
The only thing that was still sitting in position that I hadn't picked up yet was the victim's umbrella. I picked it up, let all the remaining blood run under the umbrella, put it in its container and seal it inside and bring it up with me.
A lead bullet fragment is noticed in the very same spot.
It was in a small, congealed portion of blood. And the only thing I can think of is that it was in the umbrella, because it wasn't there before I picked the umbrella up.
While the sample is taken for analysis, police interview the witnesses who reported hearing the gunshot and seeing a shadowy figure emerge from the stairwell. Due to darkness at the time of the sighting, they are unable to help with a composite sketch. As police debate whether the murders might be connected, their investigation takes another sickening turn. Only a few hundred meters from the stairwell where Sean Keegan was murdered, daylight exposes yet another rain-soaked and bloody body. 31-year-old transsexual Thomas Wilkinson lies dead in a backyard garden. He too appears to have been either badly beaten or shot in the head.
Now, he was isolated in that he's in an area that it isn't a heavy traffic area. There's nobody walking back there, obviously, so the killer could have taken his time to when he killed him.
The rain had washed away all the footprints except for two sets of footprints. One was a running shoe that matched Mr. Wilkinson's running shoes, and the other one appeared to be a hard-soled boot of some sort, rubber-soled boot, and what was obviously a man's shoe because of the size and the design of it. Draped over it was a clear plastic umbrella that he'd obviously been carrying at the time that he was shot. No signs of any struggle. The scene gave up very little other than the footprints.
While police comb the scene and canvass the neighborhood, the families of all 3 victims learn of the terrible attacks. At the same time, the news spreads across Toronto.
That started everyone talking definitely about connections. I mean, having 2 in one night, finding a third 9 hours later, all of them working in prostitution, doesn't take a genius to sort of wonder, well, I think they're connected.
But for police, no direct evidence yet links the murders. And while the proximity of Sean Keegan and Thomas Wilkinson's bodies may suggest a link, police have more questions than answers when it comes to possible motives.
Did one happen to stumble across the killing of the other one, and because of that end up being killed in their own right, or because of their similarity in occupation, whether or not we had somebody that was targeting male prostitutes in the area? We didn't know.
Investigators hope lab work will shed more light on the crimes. The recovered shell fragment comes under scrutiny at Toronto's Centre for Forensic Sciences. At the same time, autopsies are carried out on all 3 victims.
This opening of the autopsy is always the victim arriving in a body bag under seal. That's photographed by myself. What I do is I tend to look at it as a learning experience. How much can I learn from the victim? From my perspective, I tend to ask a lot of questions.
Later that same day, investigators' worst fears are confirmed. The autopsies, combined with ballistic tests, prove that all 3 victims were shot at close range by the same powerful .357 revolver.
What became apparent earlier on was the fact that each one had been shot what appeared to be execution-style or headshots, and that someone wanted to kill them.
Police now know they are dealing with a single suspect, a dangerous killer who likely planned his attacks using the thunder and the holiday fireworks to disguise his gunshots. Reports that a serial killer is on the loose shock the city.
Police don't like to use that term unless they have to. They don't want to panic the public. When you start adding that up and saying that there's possibly one person out there who's going around killing people, this puts an entirely different color on the story. And the reality, people will become very afraid.
The news strikes hardest in the community of prostitutes working in downtown Toronto.
There was a press conference called by street workers at a community center down on Church Street that was pretty intense about telling us that this is the reality of what has happened, that the fear was absolutely rife on the streets.
With little else to go on, police searching for leads focus on the one person who may be able to break the case open. The eyewitness from the 𝙀𝙀 scene, who had a fleeting glimpse of the killer's truck.
We'd gone through a process where we brought in numerous brochures from similar type vehicles, as she described, trying to identify what type of vehicle it was. And she didn't feel that any of these vehicles and any of these brochures were that vehicle.
In a rare move, investigators bring in both a hypnotist and a police sketch artist to help jog the woman's memory.
The witness agreed to undergo some hypnosis in order to see if we could, in fact, enhance her description of the vehicle and perhaps obtain some plate numbers even.
Although they are unable to retrieve any license plate numbers, a more concrete image of the truck gradually surfaces.
The witness had described there being a light on top of the truck. It almost looks like a taxi cab light. It was a fairly nondescript vehicle that really didn't match any vehicles known to us. So we had lengthy conversations on whether or not we were going to release that to the press.
When police finally do make the drawing public, it will lead to their biggest lead to date, putting them that much closer to solving a horrifying triple murder. May 24th, 1996. 3 days have passed since a brutal criminal killed 3 Toronto prostitutes. Given the execution-style nature of the shootings, along with the shared profession of the victims, profilers feel their suspect may believe he is on some kind of mission. He is deemed highly likely to strike again. Hoping an eyewitness account of his vehicle will generate leads, investigators enlist the general public in their search.
At one of the press conferences, after they had a good description of the vehicle, the police released a sketch of this mysterious red truck, a very distinctive sketch.
The truck is described as being narrow-bodied with square headlights, and most puzzling, it appears to have a light on top of the cab that may be pink in color. While the sketch circulates, police keep up an elevated presence in neighborhoods frequented by prostitutes.
Back then, it was all-encompassing. The residents of the street, the sex workers, the street people who were now living in fear about somebody out there stalking them.
There was a lot more patrols, particularly in the areas where the prostitutes applied their trade. The scout cars were dropping by the local haunts and telling them to be aware, be cautious, you know, really don't be going off to the usual places, you know, secluded places with your customers.
Perhaps most ominous, many prostitutes find the vehicle in the composite sketch familiar.
What that meant was that he'd been out there for some time, and this scared an awful lot of them. Knowing that this fellow had been out, looking at them, was he plotting?
While some detectives follow up leads on the street, others search through databases of sexual offenders and probe lists of potentially dangerous clients compiled by prostitutes for their own self-protection.
They keep these pamphlets that track bad tricks, they call them, and there's different colors for the pamphlets that indicate the severity of the bad trick, ranging from kind of bad to really bad, where there's violence involved. And the thinking was, and the police I think were looking at the same thing, has this guy been out there before? Has his license plate been written down?
Sunday, May 26th. More than 5 days have passed since the killings. While tips on the street have led to few concrete leads, the sketch of the truck has caught the attention of one Toronto resident in particular, a man who has been living with growing suspicions. The man finally speaks with a lawyer who contacts authorities.
The lawyer called the police department so that I had conversations with this lawyer, who advised me that he had a client who had information as to who was responsible for the murder of the 3 prostitutes.
The witness agrees to meet with police.
He was a very nice person, down-to-earth, concerned, responsible citizen.
He claims that on the night of the killings, a friend of his named Marcello Palma showed up unexpectedly at his door after midnight. 30-year-old Marcello, the owner of his own air conditioning repair business, was soaked from the rain and seemed nervous.
Mr. Palma owned his own business, owned his own home, married, young child, no contact with the police to speak of. From what we knew of Mr. Palma at that stage, there certainly wasn't anything to indicate that he was any sort of sexual predator or anything like that.
But according to the witness, Marcello asked for an unusual favor.
And had left a package for him to take care of for him, and in that package was a handgun, a knife, and some ammunition. The friend had then, several days later, had occasion to meet Mr. Palma again, and Mr. Palma indicated to him that the bullets that were in the package, that you maybe should think about getting rid of them, which of course then caused him to become even more suspicious. The friend had then given the package to Mr. Palma's brother and told him he wanted nothing to do with it.
With the publication of the vehicle sketch, the witness's suspicions seem confirmed. Not only did his friend Marcello Palma own a red truck, he was seen making alterations to its appearance in the wake of the murders.
He tried to remove the light, the brake light from the top of the cab. It wasn't something you would normally do. You're required to have them by law. Why would you try and turn it out?
Once Marcello Palma was identified to us, the investigation moved very, very quickly. Our main priority then was to track him down and to find him.
We had identified 3 possible locations that Mr. Palma may be at. At that time, there was police teams dispatched to those locations, not to go and arrest Mr. Palma, but to conduct static surveillance.
While police quickly note that Marcello's red truck is parked outside of his air conditioning repair business, there are few signs of the man himself. Hours pass with little movement.
We hadn't seen him, we weren't able to see him, we had surveillance on different locations, weren't able to find him.
Marcello Palma seems to have vanished into thin air. When police finally speak with his friends and family members, they learn that nobody has seen their prime suspect in at least 2 days. His disappearance, although worrying, only convinces them they are on the right track. They take their search to a national audience.
Obviously, our concern was that Mr. Palma may kill somebody else. All indications were that he'd shot 3 people, and now he was on the run.
On May 29th, 1996, a Canada-wide warrant is issued for 30-year-old Marcello Palma.
The first time I saw a picture of Marcello Palma was on the front page of our newspaper. It was a grainy photograph, large and in color. He was smiling. He looked like a pleasant young man.
He didn't look like the guy who drove around in a red van and executed prostitutes.
To be surprised at how sometimes the roughest people in the world can turn out to be real sweeties, and some of the nicest people who smile right in your face aren't. Sometimes they're chameleons.
And then the big question was, where did he go?
May 30th, 1996. A Canada-wide warrant has been issued for Marcello Palma. Although by all appearances, he is a successful business owner with no previous criminal record, police feel he may be the violent man who shot 3 prostitutes at close range with a high-powered handgun. He is considered armed and dangerous, and more than capable of striking again.
The press was very good in keeping the investigation alive and keeping it in front of the people of Toronto and all of Canada to become aware of it, and especially when we were searching for him.
Shortly after going public, police receive a tip of a possible sighting in Quebec and hear contradictory rumors regarding their suspect's intentions.
Somehow they learned that he might be driving to Montreal. He was spotted in Montreal. But by the time he was spotted and the information came back, he'd gone again.
We were receiving some information from different sources that was coming in that he wasn't dangerous, that he had left Montreal. Other people were saying he was going to go out like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. We just didn't know what we were up against.
At the same time, Marcello Palma's life in Toronto comes under intense scrutiny as police sweep for evidence.
We've got 3 search warrant scenes and we've got a vehicle we're going to seize. But each one needs a team to go in to actually deal with that scene, to do the physical collection, to do the photography, to collect all the little bits and pieces that might be important. So one team going to the suspect's home, one team going to the suspect's parents' place, and one team going to his place of business.
With each passing hour, the case against their fugitive grows stronger. In a gun safe, amongst other firearms, police find a snub-nosed .357 revolver.
It was certainly the type of gun and the caliber of gun that we were looking for.
Suspiciously, the barrel of the weapon seems to have been altered.
All firearms that fire a bullet have rifling on the inside of the barrel, which is what causes the identifiable marks on the projectiles when they come out. All the rifling on the inside of that barrel had been removed, which meant that the projectiles taken from Mr. Keegan and Mr. Wilkinson and Brenda Ludgate then couldn't be matched to the gun. It showed a guilty mind that was working very consciously of trying to get rid of evidence.
In addition, the red truck that helped break the case open also yields important clues. A slip of paper bears a phone number and the address of the building where Sean Keegan's body was discovered.
As it turned out, the phone number was to a transvestite sex trade worker who had been contacted by Mr. Palma.
He had some contact with these people. I don't know if it was contact with our three particular victims, but certainly people in the sex trade.
Even more intriguing, closer inspection reveals what may be a direct biological link to one of the victims.
The front cab of the vehicle had been cleaned up quite extensively, but underneath the passenger side seat belt, there was a single small drop of blood.
The blood is secured for DNA testing. As police in Toronto try and build a case, the search for their suspect continues across the country. Along with following up on possible sightings, detectives look for other telling traces of his movements.
We're closely watching any way that he can obtain finances or contact with any of his relatives or anything like that, credit cards, ATM cards.
June 1st, 1996. 6 days after their suspect fled Toronto, police finally get the break they've been hoping for. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, a guest checks into the expensive waterfront hotel, paying for his room with a credit card. The guest is Marcello Palma.
And lo and behold, in Halifax, he registered under his own name and his credit card.
Homicide detectives in Toronto quickly take note.
It certainly wasn't an intelligent move if his intention was to not get caught, but I got in touch with Halifax police, and I spoke to the chief there and indicated to him our situation here, who Palma was, what he was wanted for. Because of the nature of Palma's crime, they were very concerned, so Halifax police became fully engaged at that time in an effort to try to track down Palma.
3 p.m. Wearing bulletproof vests, uniformed officers arrive at the waterfront hotel. After briefing hotel security, they quietly escort other guests off the building's 3rd floor.
They cleared out the rooms to protect the people in case he wouldn't give up without a fight. They talked to a chambermaid who said that this man had behaved very strangely in her presence. No threats or anything, but just that he seemed to be very agitated.
All rooms adjacent and around him were evacuated, and we had officers go to room 326 and 330, which were on each side of him, and to wait for him.
Moments later, police make their move, bursting into the room in question. They come up empty-handed.
And the Halifax police found that he wasn't in his room.
6:30 p.m. Officers continue to wait in Palma's room for his return. At one point, someone passes close by outside, but doesn't enter. Then the phone rings, but police hear nothing but breathing on the other end. Officers feel that Palma may now be alerted to their presence. When the phone rings again, it is security down in the lobby, claiming that Marcello Palma has just been spotted leaving the hotel. 6:45 p.m. Believing their stakeout is now compromised, police begin combing outside.
Mr. Palmer had been at the hotel, and security had seen him. He left and walked towards the boardwalk. The officers at the hotel notified the station, who then dispatched some uniformed members along the waterfront, where they noticed a man fitting Mr. Palmer's description sitting on the railing. When they stood, watched him, and conversed as to whether or not it was him, he walked further out onto the wharf He knows the police were there. He started acting nervous, got up to walk away.
When confronted, the man is evasive, refusing at first to provide his name. But with nowhere left to run, the prime suspect in a triple murder finally buckles. After a cross-country manhunt, Marcello Palma is in custody. Police find a collection of ammunition in his pocket and a key to yet another hotel room across downtown. Sergeant Philip McDonald is among the detectives checking out the secondary site.
I did up a search warrant and went and searched room 7 at the bed and breakfast. And between the bed, the box spring and mattress was a .357 carbine-style rifle in a green garbage bag. And this rifle was loaded with 1 live round of ammunition. I still wonder to this day what he planned to do with it because you're not here to sightsee with a rifle.
Marcello Palma's chosen reading material also speaks volumes.
At that time, he had 2 books in his possession. One was Without Conscience and The Disturbing World of Psychopaths Among Us.
And chillingly, it was revealed that perhaps the killer was getting prepared for his future brush with the law, because he had books on psychological abnormalities. He was reading up on how to explain a person's psychoses. Was he preparing to try and get away with something?
Although now in police custody for 3 murders, Marcello Palma will eventually plead not guilty by reason of insanity, a topic he appears to have been reading up on. If successful, he may avoid prison altogether, despite committing one of Toronto's most horrifying crimes. June 3rd, 1996. Police prepare to transfer 30-year-old Marcello Palma from Halifax, Nova Scotia, back to Toronto, Ontario, where he will face charges of murdering 3 prostitutes. Homicide detective James Raymer is one of the officers accompanying the suspect on a routine commercial flight.
In most cases, you're boarded first, and you're put on the back of the plane. He is handcuffed and secured, and quite frankly, most of the passengers never even know he's on the airplane. He was very quiet. He was very polite. I think the best way for me to describe it is he wasn't acting like the type of individual that we would all think would be the type of person that would commit the murders that he did.
In Toronto, news quickly spreads of the arrest, relieving tension across the city, especially in neighborhoods where prostitutes have been fearing for their lives.
They breathed an incredible sigh of relief, and I'm sure the whole community did too. May 21st, they were killed. June the 1st, he was captured in Halifax. That's an amazing accomplishment. In that very short span of time, they took 3 anonymous killings and had the handcuffs on the killer.
With Marcello Palma now in custody, police consolidate their evidence, the most damning piece of which is confirmed through DNA testing. The small drop of blood found in Palma's truck belongs to 25-year-old murder victim Brenda Ludgate. But while physical evidence now ties their suspect to the murders, the case against Marcello Palma is far from closed. His psychological state at the time of the crimes soon takes center stage.
I think he remained a big mystery right up until the trial. You know, what was motivating him? What was his home life like? He had a wife and a young child. What happened in his mind that would lead him to go out at night and murder 3 people, point blank range with a gun to the head, you know, and with a sexual component to it. It was all very mysterious.
April 1999. In a Toronto courthouse, in a hearing presided over by judge alone, Marcello Palma pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. He admits to the killings, but denies all criminal responsibility.
The bulk of his argument was I was insane or temporarily insane, I wasn't myself, and therefore I shouldn't be found guilty of these crimes.
He appeared every day in this, immaculate Italian suit, hair combed, looking very neat, but also there was, an arrogance about him. There was certainly no sign of remorse. There was almost an assuredness that, he was going to beat this somehow.
The trial was very heavily covered by all media, and a lot of the pieces of the puzzle began to fit into place.
What emerges is the story of a deeply disturbed man. Both Marcello Palma's wife, to whom the court learns he was estranged from at the time of the murders, as well as the mistress he was seeing at the time, take the stand. They help paint a picture of a ticking time bomb.
He was a chameleon. To a lot of people, he appeared to be a normal sort of fellow. To people very close to him, though, he was a different personality at times. With his family, other stories come out about his intensities, about his rages, about his split personality. He had threatened suicide many times with his wife as part of his controlling nature. She would catch him out in a lie about having mistress, having prostitutes, and he would get terribly upset, and he pointed a gun at her on one occasion. He pointed a gun at himself on one occasion, threatening suicide. The psychiatrist testified this is all part of the control game that he was playing.
It is also revealed that 5 years prior to the murders, Marcello Palma had sought out psychiatric help, and through ongoing sessions had revealed a hatred of the very people he felt compelled to seek out late at night.
He had picked up transvestites and prostitutes. His psychiatrist testified that he regarded these people as scum. He hated them, but yet he would be with them.
Most disturbing, he had divulged homicidal fantasies, fantasies that were never taken at face value. For the defense, the deterioration of Palma's marriage, along with a fight with his mistress, finally sparked a breakdown. At the time of the murders, they claim Marcello Palma didn't know what he was doing. But the prosecution counters that the crimes bear the hallmarks of premeditated acts. Not only had Palma spoken of killing prostitutes, or as he had put it, ridding the streets of scum, but he went out on the night of May 21st, 1996, a stormy and fireworks-filled night that would mask gunfire with a loaded .357 revolver at his side.
When he was rejected that night and went to the streets, he decided to reap revenge on the very people that he hated. And yet, there's a self-loathing in that he would go to them. But there was a self-punishment in this as well, I believe. And went out on the street and picked up a prostitute, and the killing started. And so he left Brenda Ludgate in a parking lot. He left Sean Keegan lying at the bottom of a stairwell. And he left Tom Wilkinson, whose street name was Deanna, lying on a graveled alleyway next to a bed and breakfast.
April 2001. After 2 years of intermittent hearings, the judge finally renders his verdict, rejecting Marcello Palma's insanity plea and finding him guilty of all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Marcello Palma is promptly sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years.
The trial brought a closure for a lot of people. In this case, once the door is closed and the cell is locked behind Marcello Palma, people felt relief.
Today, Marcello Palma sits behind bars in a maximum security prison in central Canada. For those who knew his victims, as well as for those still working on Toronto's streets, no amount of justice can erase the lingering effects of 3 horrible crimes.
they were young people growing up, and as problematic as their lives might have been, there were people who cared for them. You know, there were people who loved them.
The healing process on the streets probably taught a lot of the street people to be a little more careful. They look after themselves maybe a little bit more as a result of this. Somewhere in the back of their minds is, don't go down that dark alley. Check out that guy in that car a little more carefully.
It still reverberates. It's a constant worry for prostitutes, and there are unsolved homicides in the city of prostitutes. These ones, they found the guy, but there's a lot that have remained unsolved, and the killers are out there.